great to be here. Great to be presenting alongside Mark, Casper, and Anthony. I'm from Canada, so it was great to see Canada featured so heavily in the keynote presentation. So today I'll be presenting on a project that I've been working on for a little while on the do's and don'ts of well-being aggregation. So first things first, what are indicators and why do we need them? So indicators are specific, observable, and measurable quantities that can be used to measure change towards a certain outcome. The reason why policymakers use indicators is to evaluate policies that are bringing us closer or further away from a certain goal. So we're probably all familiar with GDP as a indicator. And GDP was actually developed in the wake of the Great Depression. So the US government needed to know, how bad was the crisis really? In the Great Depression, there was rising unemployment, food shortages, unprecedented credit defaults, and the events that inspired John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, about a family during the Oklahoma Dust Bowl that had to decide whether they had to move out west to California to seek better economic opportunities. Now, after some years of this measure being used to measure kind of economic progress, it also started being used for kind of a host of other measures of progress, including social progress. So it became kind of a one-stop shop for measures of progress. And that leads me to my next question, which is what makes a good indicator? And then in the years since GDP has been developed, even the developer of GDP himself has says that this is a bad tool for policymaking. And in 2008, the French president commissioned a report on the limitations of GDP as a measure of economic progress and social progress. And the authors said that it's high time that we move on to, involving some measures of people's well-being. But something in their report that really struck a chord with me was when they said that what we measure shapes what we collectively strive to pursue. But as Mark said before, and what I also think is true, is that the reverse is also true. So what we pursue also shapes what we measure. And so this was true for GDP, right? It was created for a certain purpose. It was reactionary. This is true for the Sustainable Development Goals in response to the destruction of the environment and rising global temperatures. So why am I speaking about the limitations of GDP at the Measuring Progress Conference of all places? Isn't this obvious? Am I not just preaching to the choir? Well, yes and no. The reason why I'm talking about the limitations of GDP was because over the years, it has been used as the primary measure of all sorts of different outcomes. And this has led to some negative consequences, including, for example, the destruction of our environment. And what we want to avoid is we want our well-being measurements to avoid the same fate. We want our well-being measurements to have tenacity. We want our well-being measurements to lead to better policymaking and ultimately better outcomes. The problem is that whenever we measure something, whenever we aggregate the measurements, we are ultimately going to lose certain information. And why this is so important for well-being is a morally relevant factor, which means that it is a quality of individuals' lives which is worthy of moral consideration. And whenever we're concealing information about well-being, we must be concealing morally important information. And so what this might lead to is us endorsing policies and outcomes that may actually result in outcomes that we might not want to happen at all. And for example, this could be a policy that increases well-being at the top end of the well-being continuum at the expense of those that are worse off, just to a lesser degree. But I want to illustrate this with a simple example. So let's say we want to compare the well-being of group A to the well-being of group B. And in this case, the way we want to aggregate well-being is we're characterizing the well-being of these groups by looking at their average. So group A's well-being is 7, group B's well-being is 7.3. So if we had no other information, we might say that the well-being of group B is better than that of group A. But I want to challenge this. Is this really true? For example, in group B, we have an individual who has the lowest well-being of all these 6 individuals. And if we treat group B as group A at a later time point, would we really say that the individual who has the lowest well-being in group A, losing a unit of well-being is truly the better outcome, I'll let you decide that. But so the way that we typically aggregate well-being is actually strikingly similar to this simple case. For example, in the World Happiness Report, the happiness of a country is judged by average life satisfaction. And what this does is that it implicitly endorses values of average utilitarianism, which basically says that we ought to maximize well-being in such a way that increases the well-being, the average well-being, right? And the problem with this is that, like I mentioned before, this might lead us to endorse policies that increase well-being at the top end of the well-being continuum at the expense of the well-being at the bottom end of the continuum, as long as it's to a smaller degree. And not only does it do this, it also violates the difference principle, which says that we can tolerate inequality to the extent that it benefits the worst off. But thankfully, there are some alternative theories that we can use to inform our methods of aggregation. And I'll go through a couple of them today. This is not an exhaustive list, but just a kind of a sample. So first, we have prioritarianism, developed by Derek Parfit. And what prioritarianism says, this ethical position basically says that we ought to maximize well-being in such a way that it increases the well-being of the worst off more than it does those that are already better off. Next, we have sufficientarianism, which basically says that just as everyone should enjoy basic fundamental human rights, everyone should enjoy some basic level of well-being. And so the extreme version of this ethical position is that we should just ignore the well-being of individuals above this threshold and only focus on getting people above a certain threshold. And lastly, and this theory is only loosely aggregative, is egalitarianism. And this position basically says that a society is only better off if the well-being distribution in that society is more equal. And so this comes from the idea that it is intrinsically worse off for individuals, or it's intrinsically bad for individuals to be worse off than others. And so the question that I wanted to ask is, does it really make a difference how we go about aggregating well-being to a population level, right? Will it actually make a difference in terms of how countries rank compared to one another? And so what I was interested in looking at is whether countries would rank differently according to these different ethical positions. But before I could do that, I had to figure out a way to translate these ethical positions into formulas that I can then empirically test whether the ranking was truly different. So on the next slide, I'm showing the kind of formulas that I used to empirically calculate these differences. I'll spare you the details of averagism, but for prioritarianism, we need to make sure that we weigh increases or decreases to the well-being of individuals at the kind of bottom end of the well-being continuum more than we do changes to the well-being at the top end of the well-being spectrum. And so here we need a function G, which is a strictly increasing concave function to essentially account for that ethical stance, so basically a marginally diminishing marginal utility function. And so I chose the simplest one I could think of, which was the square root function. Then we have the sufficientarianism method. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, but the simplest one is just using the head count method. So simply how many people find themselves below a threshold compared to the rest of the population. And for egalitarianism, I took a page from the book of income inequality and looked at the Gini coefficient, which is typically used as a measure of income inequality, but it can also be used to characterize the how unequal or equal the distribution of well-being is. And this is calculated using the Lorenz curve, where A is the area between the line of perfect equality and the Lorenz curve. And so the data that I used for this comes from the Gallup World Poll. So the Gallup World Poll is a survey that does that conducts questionnaires in more than 130 different countries. I used life satisfaction to operationalize well-being in this case. And because I was interested in looking at the differences in these indicators over time, I chose to look at the difference in these well-being scores between 2013 and 2020, which to me seemed like a long enough time point for any policies or changes to take place. I also wanted to avoid COVID here, but I could have in theory chosen different time points. So without further ado, I'll show you some of the results. So here you're seeing the rankings according to average utilitarianism. So here on the x-axis, you're seeing the change in average well-being. And on the y-axis, you're seeing a select list of countries. We start with Benin to Romania as countries that have increased in terms of average well-being. Their well-being has increased the most out of 130 countries. Then we have from Ecuador to Bangladesh. These are countries whose average well-being has not changed that much or is not significantly different from no change at all. And then we have countries towards the bottom, so Panama to Venezuela. These countries experienced the greatest declines in average well-being from 2013 to 2020. Now moving on to prioritarianism, and here the x-axis changes slightly. So instead of measuring changes to average well-being, here it's measuring change in prioritarianist well-being, which essentially means that these countries on the top here, so from Romania to Hungary, these countries not only increased their average well-being, but they also did it in such a way that benefited the worst off more so than those that were already better off, or were saying that they were more satisfied with their lives. Moving on to sufficientarianism, here I want to say that the threshold that I chose was anyone who rated their life satisfaction as 4 or below. I could have been more conservative and chosen a threshold of 2, but for illustration's sake, I chose 4 as kind of a threshold that we want to lift people above. And here the x-axis has values in percentages. So for example, Afghanistan here in 2020 had 30% more individuals identify themselves as having a life satisfaction of 4 or below. And if we compare this to Benin, 30% less people, or about 30% less people, identified themselves as 4 or below on the life satisfaction scale. And here, finally, for the aggregative theory informed by the ethical position of egalitarianism, here the countries have changed a lot. And this is because looking at the Gini coefficient is only loosely aggregative. It has kind of no information pertaining to average well-being or kind of increases or decreases. It's all about the distribution. And so here on the x-axis, you see, towards the right is an increase in the Gini coefficient. So, for example, Zimbabwe has, from 2013 to 2020, has become more unequal. So the distribution of well-being has become more unequal. And if we compare it to, for example, countries that are kind of on the top of the list of becoming more equal, we're seeing Denmark, Ireland, Netherlands, whose well-being distributions have become more equal. Now, I want to emphasize here once again that this says nothing about whether well-being has increased or decreased. And so this is kind of one of the foreshadowing a little bit, one of the flaws with just looking at the distribution of well-being, because people could be, tending towards a higher well-being or a lower well-being, but and it would appear as though the well-being distribution is becoming more equal. And so finally, for the results that are going to answer this question, how big of a difference does it really make if we rank countries according to different aggregation methods informed by different ethical stances? So here on the x-axis, you're seeing the rank, and I won't make you wait any longer. Here are a select list of countries and their rankings according to these different aggregative methods. And I want to share a couple of specific examples. So for example, Bahrain here, we see it's doing fantastic in terms of increases to average well-being. It ranks 2nd in the world. But in terms of becoming more equal, it is at the kind of bottom end of the rankings in terms of egalitarianism. So even though Bahrain has gained in average well-being, it has also become a lot more unequal. Then Hong Kong has kind of the opposite situation happening. I don't quite want to call it a problem, but something different is happening here. So Hong Kong has become a lot more equal in terms of the well-being distribution, but at the same time, it ranks kind of towards the bottom of the ranking when it comes to lifting people above this threshold. And if we look into the data, the amount of people identifying themselves as 4 or below on the life satisfaction scale has increased by 2%. And finally, I couldn't miss the opportunity to speak about Luxembourg. In Luxembourg, and so here the spread is a lot smaller. So here it's kind of a similar thing is happening as in Hong Kong, where you're seeing a lot more kind of equal well-being distributions over the years, but at the same time, kind of middle of the pack when it comes to lifting people above this threshold. And so the answer to the original question was yes, it does matter what aggregation method that we use, right? Different aggregation principles result in different rankings. But why is this important? This is important because what we measure is what we try to maximize, right? A country that tries to maximize average well-being should be measuring average well-being. A country that is trying to lift people above a certain threshold, that's what it should be measuring. But the problem is that when there's a mismatch, and often this mismatch is not necessarily on purpose. Sometimes it just happens by default because we tend to default to using the average as a descriptor of our population well-being. And so a country that is trying to lift people out of misery but is using average metrics is going to run into the problem of endorsing policies that can be increasing well-being at the top end of the spectrum while actually decreasing well-being at the bottom end of the spectrum. But here's the thing, no aggregation method is perfect. So remember at the top of the presentation, I said that there is a lot of information concealed, whichever metric you use. So ultimately, there is uncertainty about which one we want to prioritize because every single one of them is going to conceal certain information. And we all have different ethical positions and different ways of prioritizing, whether increasing average well-being is more important or lifting people up from misery is more important. So I guess to end my talk, I want to kind of talk about some of the future steps that we can take to be kind of more transparent in terms of more ethically or more ethical measurement of well-being or population well-being. So first, if we have to, we can clearly state what method we're using to aggregate well-being, and we can also state its limitations. The other thing we can do is we can, like a lot of people have been saying today, just expand the set of well-being indices, right? Not just have one. And what this allows us to do and see is to see whether, if a country is performing well on all the sets of different well-being indices that are aggregated in different ways, well, this country is probably moving in a direction, in the right direction. And finally, we also can develop a single metric based on a kind of linear combination of different aggregation methods. And so this will take a little bit more time. Hopefully, this will be kind of a democratically informed metric because everyone has different intuitions for what we should prioritize. So either one of these three options would be a great way that kind of moves us away from defaulting to using the average and gets us closer to being more transparent when it comes to stating our ethical positions and being more responsible when it comes to aggregating population well-being. And if you forget everything that I talked about today, I want you to remember this one thing, and that is what we pursue shapes what we measure. And so if what we want to pursue is increasing average well-being, then by all means, let's continue business as usual. But if that's not the case, and my intuition says that it's not, then we should try to aggregate well-being differently, or at least be more transparent when it comes to reporting our population well-being. Thank you very much, and I am happy to take your questions.
Thank you. I have two suggestions. The first is the Gini you're using is relative Gini, which means that it's a measure, is scale invariant. Because you were criticizing that type of Gini, the Gini you want is absolute Gini, which is simply Gini times the mean. So you could use absolute Gini, and that would solve all the criticism you are having. And the second is about sufficientarianism. I think the threshold should depend on the the country, because people may be using the metrics differently. So don't use 4 for everybody, but maybe you take a percentage, I don't know, of the mean or of the median that is used, so that you can include the fact that the scale may be used differently in the countries. Thanks.
Oh, can I just quickly respond to that? I just want to say thank you. Those are both great ideas. So thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. This is super interesting. And with your 5 examples that you showed us of the countries, it is really starking how different the rankings are, which I'm a bit surprised about because of the bounded scale and generally what we know about well-being measures. I would assume that moving the average largely moves people from the misery, because we also know from the literature that the drivers are similar. Could you maybe speak a bit more about the general relations between these rankings, not in these 5 countries, but do you have some measure of correlation of these rankings? Which methods are more close to each other, which are further, so that we have a better understanding? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So yeah, I was also surprised that some of the rankings were so far apart. I didn't do any formal correlation, just seeing which measures are closer together, but that is a great suggestion for something I can do. I just based on observing the data and what it looked and what the rankings look like, the measures that were more closer together were measurements that were informed by averagism and prioritarianism. So those two, and that probably makes sense just because of how the formula constructed. The average also tracks prioritarianist aggregation methods. Egalitarianism is a method that doesn't really refer to the average at all, until I guess if we use if we use the absolute Gini coefficient. But overall, usually what happens is that countries that rank towards the top of the list when it comes to the average aggregation method, they tend to also be the ones that have high rankings in terms of prioritarianist measurement, and also higher egalitarianist measurement. And similarly for the countries at the bottom. So it's the ones in between that show the most variance. And maybe a last point that I'll mention is the reason why potentially there's a lot of differences between the average measure calculation and then the sufficientarianist calculation is because in order to lift people above the threshold, you need people who are below the threshold to get above it, right? So that's why we're seeing such a difference, because some of the countries that are listed towards the top or in the middle, they might not even have that many people that they are lifting above the threshold. And so that's why we're not seeing much of a difference. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Hi, this is so great, super interesting. And my question / comment might be super far out of your interest, so take it or leave it. But I'm in that slide that you showed with that smaller selection of countries, it has me wondering like that a follow-up question is, okay, so what are they doing in these different places to yield these different results? And so yeah, I'm just curious in general about what your next steps of this work might look like.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, so I did that for a couple of the countries, mainly. So I was really interested what was happening in Benin, because it was, ranking at the top of the list in both average aggregation and prioritarianist aggregation. And when I was trying to find information about what was happening between 2013 and 2020 that could have been responsible for this change, I couldn't really find much, except ironically GDP growth. And so when I was looking at it, I was really hoping to find something else other than GDP growth that was maybe responsible for this change. But yeah, over those years, it did have a GDP growth of about maybe like 6 to 7%, which the economists in the room can say whether that's large or small, but I have a feeling that that's pretty large. But I was really hoping to find something else, but yes, that it would be a great follow-up, and I hope that this will be the follow-up to the study, is looking at what could be responsible for these changes. So thank you.